My reflection of Magic Breakfast prior to me joining is that it's set out with an intention to change things. And if you are successful in that, you're going to have to change too.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders actually are doing and what they've learned along the way.
My guest today is Lindsey MacDonald, Chief Executive Officer of Magic Breakfast, a national charity working to ensure that children at risk of hunger start the school day with a nutritious breakfast, so they're settled, focused, and ready to learn. Operating at the intersection of education, inequality, and public policy, Magic Breakfast plays a critical role in tackling child food insecurity and supporting better long-term outcomes for children across the UK. At a moment when government policy on school breakfast provision is evolving, I'm keen to explore how she's leading Magic Breakfast through this changing landscape, balancing direct delivery with advocacy, collaboration, and system-level change to ensure no child is too hungry to learn. Lindsey, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Maybe just to get us going, for listeners who might be less familiar with Magic Breakfast, how did it come into being, and what was the problem it was trying to solve then that wasn't adequately being tackled?
So just over 20 years ago, a woman, an absolutely indomitable spirit, Carmel McConnell, an author, was doing some research in London to try and understand why were some schools outperforming others. Why were there some schools in Hackney where children seemed to be, just intrinsically doing worse in their exam results, their grades, their kind of academic achievement? And so she started to interview head teachers and spoke to them independently of one another. They didn't collude or bring their answers together. And consistently, they all said, because they're hungry. Some children, in our school are starting the day with nothing in their tummies. We have English and maths at the start of the day in the curriculum, and they're having to wait, if they're lucky, until lunchtime until they get something to eat. They can't focus, they can't concentrate. And like so many, brilliant charities, ours was set up because Carmel wasn't willing to stand by, hear that, and not act. She took action the very next day. She went back to the school with food and provided some bagels delivered from the boot of her car and said, hopefully this can cover today. Let me go talk to some of my friends. I'll be back tomorrow. And, here we are 23 years later, continuing to deliver on that moral outrage that she felt, that there were children in the UK, sixth largest in the world, struggling to focus and learn from our brilliant education system.
So could you give us a snapshot of Magic Breakfast today, the scale of your reach, the kinds of schools and children you support, the work you do with partners on the ground? What does all that look like? And maybe even touch a little bit on, kind of where does the money come from and how does that turn into breakfast?
So I suppose, 20 plus years later, we are still providing bagels and many other food products through our Magic menu to over 1,000 schools. So we provide access to a nourishing breakfast every day to more than 350,000 children and young people. And we do so in partnership with schools across England and Scotland. So schools come to Magic Breakfast, they ask for our support, and they are eligible for our support if 35% or more of their pupils are eligible for free school meals, because we can't, unfortunately, afford to provide to every school.
Yeah.
And what's really important about the Magic Breakfast model is we, first of all, take the pressure and the stress off school staff and teachers because they are dealing with and contending with an awful lot, especially since COVID. So we make sure that the food is delivered to their gates, conveniently, either once a week or once a fortnight. And we also provide them with the advice and support to launch, implement, and optimize that breakfast provision. So when a school joins Magic Breakfast, they sign up to our terms and conditions. It's universal. It is stigma and barrier free. And you focus on alleviating hunger. And the reason why we call that out is because you could, for example, provide breakfast focusing on providing childcare, alleviating pressure on parents' schedules, for instance. But ours is really child and young person focused. So that's how we talk about, we tackle child morning hunger today. But we also want to end it for good. So based on decades of experience, we've built up an evidence base. We do continuous evaluation and, hopefully improvement of our programs. And we are continuously looking to share that learning, not just with schools, but with policymakers and decision makers. So we do a lot of advocacy, we share research, we publish findings, we do our annual breakfast survey, and that's about ending child morning hunger for good.
How does that happen? When I say how does that happen, what's your vision of how we eliminate it?
So I guess in terms of how we envisage it happening, I think, and it's been fascinating, as you can imagine, a fascinating year or so for Magic Breakfast, as we have genuinely seen commitments, promises, even some policy steps toward addressing what we've been working toward and focusing on. And I think what's incredible and something that we remain open to is the fact that we need to adapt as the system adapts. So if you said, what would it look like to put yourselves out of business? There are different ways that you could do that. So you could tackle the root causes of child morning hunger. You could eliminate food insecurity. You could remove child poverty. You could, eradicate negligence and, neglect. Ultimately, you could account for every potential traffic jam that a parent may meet on their way to dropping their child at school. There are so many reasons why a child arrives at school hungry. Not only, the kind of, I suppose, dominant factor that we are concerned about, which is poverty and food insecurity. So if you recognize that, okay, it's probably not going to happen in the immediate future that we can eliminate all of those root causes, then what does it look like to provide breakfast at the start of the school day for every child and young person in the UK? So that has been very much our focus on that policy and that advocacy. And then continuing to, I suppose, respond and adapt and support the system to deliver that policy promise. So we've had the pilot in England and the pilot in Scotland currently underway this academic year, helping both countries, both governments, both school and education systems to understand, okay, what works? How do we go from this being entirely voluntary and charitably funded to something that, is actually potentially going to be part of, in England, the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. So there's a whole shift there where schools won't be choosing to provide a free breakfast club at the start of the school day. By law, they will be required to. And, what are the consequences of creating that expectation and that requirement on schools, on teachers, on educators? So I suppose a long way of saying we don't know exactly what that answer will look like, but what we do have is a North Star of what it should be like for children and young people. So every child and young person should be nourished, empowered, and thriving. And the reason why we use that language is because it's not enough to say, here's a very nutritious breakfast. Your tummy is full, you've got the nutrients you need, but maybe it was provided in an unwelcoming way. We talk a lot about Magic Breakfast being much more than the bowl or the plate of food. It's the magic around that. The fact that the head teacher says hello to every child when they walk through. The fact that you have pupils who are supporting, older pupils supporting the younger pupils, creating real connection and a sense of belonging in that school community. That's what we envisage and envision as that real end of Magic Breakfast's role.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to ask a question that could sound sort of depressing, but I suspect it's one you've thought about, which is it does seem to me there's an enormous difference between a school that now can deliver something and a school that has to deliver something. Beyond recognizing that they're different, do you have any thoughts about that as it might play out?
We've been talking about this actively for the last, 12 to 18 months because you're right, it is absolutely a shift that we need to acknowledge. And again, those unintended consequences, what does that lead to? And so we brought together a group of, I suppose, stakeholders, people in the sector about a year ago now with Northumbria University, and we envisioned what does this policy look like when it's operating successfully, when it's fully rolled out. Operational challenges that will inevitably happen in the first few years have been ironed out. It's actually really simple. At the heart of it, you have children and young people who want to go to Breakfast Club. They look forward to it. So if that's your ideal state, really empowering children and young people's voice to decide and set what success and what positive impact looks like, what a brilliant breakfast club is, then that virtuous cycle will ensure that parents want to get their children to that place. Teachers and school staff are creating an environment that is welcoming, warm, inclusive, magical. And it's not something that's, stigmatizing. You wouldn't want to end up in a situation, for example, where it's somewhere that children who are experiencing poverty, food insecurity, it's where they must get to because otherwise they won't get breakfast. It's where you want every child and young person to want to get to. So I think the shift for us as a charity has been moving our mindset and our narrative and our worldview from what do children need to what do children and young people want. We believe that will create the conditions to, as it were, override that concern that you call out.
Yeah. I can see this sort of fairly biological connection between breakfast in the morning and learning. But as you've talked about it, there's clearly a lot more going on. And I wonder if you could sort of just paint the picture a little more broadly about how all this fits into educational attainment, child well-being, and maybe, well-being even beyond the school years.
Absolutely. The research about Magic Breakfast's model in our program has highlighted, for years now, the fact that, as you say, there's the biological benefits, kind of the nutrients, the healthy food, the food that we provide. We really think about what our breakfast food is and making sure that the energy level, the energy release of those food products, so higher fiber, protein, etc., really do tide the children through to that lunchtime meal. So, there's all of that, as you say, biology that you want to think about. That then plays into cognitive function, brain development, health. We have been seeing in some communities illnesses and instances of malnutrition that reflect, effectively Victorian era disease and malnutrition. There's all of that side of things. But as you say, actually, it's the impact on the school day and the school community and the experience of school. So a child walks in and feels welcomed. They feel like they belong. I've seen it so many times when I've walked in and a teacher or a staff member has seen a child walk in and recognize something's going on, and they just have that conversation, just how is the journey in, and they can quickly identify maybe safeguarding issues or some of what that child has navigated and left behind at home the day before. You also have one of the things that really struck me when I joined Magic Breakfast was understanding that actually the research shows it's not just the children who attend Breakfast Club that benefit. It actually has a positive impact on every child in that school. So the ripple effect of children not being hungry, of, not acting out the kind of physical manifestations of dealing with hunger, whether that's tiredness or frustration, confusion, all of those things, if they're not addressed, get taken into a classroom setting. And the ripple effect of a breakfast provision in a school, you may have, on average, we have between 60 and 80% of pupils in Magic Breakfast supported schools accessing breakfast, but 100% of the children and young people in that school will benefit from that.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself and about the path that took you to Magic Breakfast.
Yeah, so you may have guessed or gathered from the slightly muddled mid-Atlantic accent. I was born in the UK. I was born in Yorkshire and moved to Canada and grew up on a really small island, Prince Edward Island, where we didn't have charities or that kind of organized structural, charitable support, but we had community. And everyone had to and did pitch in. So my, I suppose, upbringing, and I didn't reflect on this until kind of I got older and looked at what me and my siblings all predominantly do. And most of us work in the kind of social space. And I don't think that's, a kind of a coincidence or by chance. It's the fact that our parents they were always active parts of our local community, whether it was setting up and running a football club or helping to wash the dishes after a community fundraising dinner for a family that had gone through something more challenging. So I suppose that was my kind of foundation in the charity space, if I can call it that. And after university, I found out that actually there were charities where you could have a career. And so when I moved back to the UK and, very much one of those people who thought, I'll go for a year. I was with my then boyfriend, now husband. When we moved here, I said, I'm going to get a job in the charity sector. So I started international development, had, amazing experiences through that. But it was actually after the 2008 financial crash. And we had friends who, were affected by that for different reasons, whether it was, redundancies, job losses, housing situation. And I recognized there was an awful lot for me to be doing in my own community, never mind traveling abroad and working further afield. So moved into homelessness. When I was working in the homelessness sector, I set up a charity called the Homeless FA. So I've always loved and played sport. And that was, I guess, an opportunity in a moment when I really understood the power of, the power of positive framings. I see so many similarities with that in terms of Magic Breakfast, the power of bringing people, children, around a meal, that sense of community and that positive framing.
Maybe I'm just kind of catching up with you, but this idea of breakfast club, not as being something you have to do as a child, but that you get to do.
Exactly.
It's something, that now I want to be part of this.
Exactly. When I was running the Homeless FA, I did my PhD, and one of the key findings from that was actually the real impact of having a person experiencing homelessness put on an Arsenal kit or a Newcastle United kit or, the England kit, was that they had a different identity. They had a label being put on them, and it was a positive one. And the conversations they had with their peers, with their teammates, were positive ones. They're positive spaces. Prior to joining Magic Breakfast, I'd moved into a youth employment charity, Street League, and they very much help, 16 to 25-year-olds build their confidence, their skills, and move into sustained employment. And again, it was that really positive space where people feel and are able to thrive. I think there are so many spaces where we maybe don't feel like we're thriving, and it's really important that we create the positive ones too.
And I also, one other thing that really resonates with me is that you're pointing to there is the importance of identity, that how people think of themselves and how sometimes even simple things, like you say, putting on a kit maybe not forever, but at least for a period of time, shift how people think about themselves. And that opens up so many other things. And I think it's really powerful.
On the identity piece, and I guess taking it back to the shifts and Magic Breakfast, it's been really interesting and challenging at times to reflect on what's our identity as an organization. We move away from providing breakfasts to ensuring that breakfasts that are provided by others are magical, inclusive, and impactful. To your point, it's really important individual's identity, but also organizational identity and how those two interact and interplay.
We may be getting ahead of the story, but just for a minute, I heard what you said there is you might already even be in the process of reimagining what's the identity of Magic Breakfasts. What's our role? What do we do in the world? You might not have meant it, but as you talked about that, it almost sounded like you could end up in a kind of regulatory role. And that would, to me, that doesn't feel like the vibe I'm getting.
No, we definitely wouldn't be a regulator. My reflection of Magic Breakfast prior to me joining is that it's set out with an intention to change things. And if you are successful in that, you're going to have to change too. So Magic Breakfast's identity has evolved significantly already. And I think we just recognize the ongoing need to kind of evolve and develop. There are sadly far too many hungry children in the UK, and the system is far too complicated for one organization to address that. So we need to do it in collaboration and in concert with others in the system. So we need to adapt and change. And you're also hopefully influencing, inspiring others to shift and change as well.
So in 2021, you became the CEO. At that time, kind of what was the focus? How did you sort of adapt into that role of being the CEO?
Yeah, it was, so 2021, that time and the kind of recruitment period was just as we were navigating lockdown still, and food insecurity was rising, and the cost of living crisis was starting to emerge. February 2022, I guess, not too many months into my tenure, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the price of wheat, which is a significant component of quite a lot of breakfast foods, and all of the transport, the oil, all of those costs, our costs increased almost overnight by 19% in my first few months in post. When I first joined, it was quite quickly trying to grasp the scale of the problem, which had expanded exponentially, almost not without people realizing it, because there were lots of people in the charity sector shouting about it, but catching up. I always remember the fact that on the kind of, recruitment paragraph, that I kind of read in that first instance, it was 1.9 million children and young people in the UK, are at risk of hunger at the start of the day. By the time I joined, that had reached, I think, 4.3 million.
Wow.
So in the course of a recruitment process, that had just really taken off and had started to spiral, I suppose, in a detrimental way. The first step was assessing and understanding and almost redefining the scale of the problem and the need. And then the other piece, I think, that was really crucial from an internal perspective was making sure that Magic Breakfast had, really one team as a mindset. There had been really great progress made on the kind of advocacy and research side of things. Obviously, an amazing track record on delivery, but they hadn't yet been brought together in a way that leveraged each other. That first year was trying to get our heads around the size of the problem. And then second, how are we going to address it in a way that is joined up, strategic, and leveraging all of our competencies, our assets, and our strengths.
What I hear in that is you could say you had to rethink your strategy, or maybe you just had to rethink your operational plan, but there was a lot of change going on. How did you, as the chief exec, sort of manage that? Who did you bring together? What conversations happened at different times with different people? How much of it was, in a workshop, and how much of it was walking down a corridor on our way to another meeting?
So I think if I start almost from the inside and then go out, internally in my first month, I made a point of meeting with and hearing from every member of staff and every trustee, having a conversation and hearing their wisdom, because across the organization, so many of our team are former teachers themselves. Secondly, was bringing that whole team together. Again, kind of post-lockdown, we had these two, incredible days, hard work, but brilliant. And we reset our values, our vision, and our mission. And they weren't radical changes, but they were aligning what do we mean by this, so that we had everyone, walking in that same direction. And then I suppose the external piece was very much understanding what were other organizations doing and how could we best help. So again, we stopped things at that point, things that, they were great, they made a difference, but they didn't or couldn't make as much of a difference as if we invested our real energy and resource into doing what we know we do well. So we made some hard decisions. We had quite a comprehensive holiday hunger provision, which ran over the holidays. But when we looked at the cost per breakfast, the kind of clear impact of those breakfasts, it just wasn't robust. And that would have been, all right if we didn't have a surging demand for what we know we can do well and efficiently. So we had a lot of those difficult conversations, and then speaking to and listening to partners, to funders, to supporters to understand not just what we wanted to achieve, but also what they saw to help us and to work with us. We have some corporate partners, for instance, who are absolutely incredible in terms of raising awareness about food insecurity, child morning hunger, the opportunity for school breakfasts to really, improve nutrition and health outcomes across the country, thinking beyond the fundraising cash and thinking more toward that, strategic support that they might be able to offer the cause, not just Magic Breakfast, the charity.
And in that, it sounds like you would have had to significantly ramp up the amount of money you were getting. Or am I missing something there?
We have grown significantly in terms of brilliant fundraising and development. And there's a combination of external factors. So I think, again, lockdown during COVID, the sudden understanding and awareness in the country that a lot of children in our country are being fed by the school system. And that provision was all of a sudden taken away. And so I think you had the need was really exposed, was one thing. I think the other fortunate situation has been an increasing understanding and focus of, if we want the country to do well, kind of our futures to be, strong and thriving, you need to invest in children and in education. I suppose we almost had a double story that we were able to tell. And, a robust, as I say, evidence base, which highlighted kind of return on investment. When you're looking at a time when there are so many, unfortunately, kind of causes that need support, the fact were able to really clearly articulate, if you put £1 into school breakfasts in the Magic Breakfast model, you will get £50 in return, wider public benefit. That was done by pro bono economics. And points like that have really helped us to unlock, new and also growing our partnerships. I suppose the final thing that we've worked really hard on, which is the brilliant delivery team, is being able to scale our capacity. You could raise all of the funds you want, but if you haven't got the capacity and the infrastructure that can scale to provide more breakfast, then that's not going to work. So I mentioned the magic menu, and that was an innovation to give us the agility to provide more breakfasts, more choice and variety, but not be quite as constrained by our supply chain as we had been before. So some real operational efficiencies that enabled us to spend money more effectively too.
So if you can describe it relatively simple, how did the magic menu change things? What actually happened there that allowed you to scale up volume without creating a huge mess in the back office?
Yeah, so we moved from food products to food categories. So what was happening is that we had, our schools expected to get bagels and they expected to get beans, they expected to get cereals. And if we ever wanted to change that kind of provision, it was quite an undertaking. The magic menu is, what food categories would you like to provide in your school? Bakery, cereals,
Right.
proteins, milk, etc. And what that allowed us to do then is provide, a mix of bagels, bread, crumpets as part of that bakery category, as an example. And that was really crucial, especially as I keep going back to wheat prices, but that was essentially the first my time was learning an awful lot about wheat prices. And that was just something that we were then able to kind of navigate. And also supply chains, again, something we may all forget, but there was a cardboard shortage at some point with Brexit and again, supply chain challenges. So certain cereals we couldn't provide consistently. But because we now set up an agreement with our schools, you will get cereals, not you will get these cereals in these quantities, in these volumes. It just enabled greater flexibility for us to meet their needs.
And did that lead to any, from the student perspective, from the child perspective, was that, wow, this is really great because it's not the same thing every day? Or was this, I never know what I'm going to get? How did that land?
So bagels would never disappear. And that would be the one.
That's like the defining item.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to oversee that decision. But it just meant that, for example, say you have 100 servings, 20 of them may be crumpets, 20 of them may be bread, and 60 may be bagels. Whereas historically, the school would say 100 bagels. So from our perspective and, the feedback that we've had from children and from schools is the choice and variety has been a positive and actually quite surprising at times. So I think we've definitely had school leaders and school staff who said, don't think that, the children are necessarily going to like that. I think the most, I don't want to say controversial, but the food product that I hear most about when I visit schools are crumpets. And they are the Marmite, the magic menu. They are either love or not. And so I'm always, that's my first question when I walk in. What's your view on crumpets in the school? Exactly. And then what's really interesting is it changes, as students grow, go through and, maybe somebody kind of catches on to crumpets. It could shift the whole dynamic. So there was a school I visited that they said, this cereal, nobody ever wanted it. And then all of a sudden, hit upon by somebody who like, oh, I like this cereal. And that was it. It was the most popular cereal.
Everybody else liked it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, the two words you use there, it seems to me, are pretty good indicators of things broadly people are going to like, up to a limit, which is choice and variety. So I could see how that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So when you first came in, there was clearly a lot of sort of rethinking the vision and the values and maybe not change, as you say, maybe not changing them very much. Has that been sort of an ongoing process, or once you did that, then it was 3 or 4 years of that's all behind us. Now we just need to make it happen?
Essentially, what we've ended up having was we had a new business plan, 3-year business plan, 2022 to 2025. That was all about laying the foundations, becoming, as I said, scalable more cost effective and all those good things, diversifying our income streams. And then in 2024, obviously recognizing the end of that business plan was upon us, we set out, and with all of the kind of political longer term changes happening, and we set out to develop a new long term strategy. So it was originally framed as the Beyond 2025 strategy. It was launched in November 2025 and is now known as Nourishing Futures. And it's our strategy for 2040. So it's a 15-year strategy. And we really did rethink everything. Like, what's the role? Are we just about getting breakfast out to schools, or actually with the policy changes and, introduction of schools must rather than schools can, what's our role within that potential? So we updated, more significantly our vision, which is where we moved from removing hunger to ensuring every child and young person is nourished, empowered, and thriving. We've kind of gone through that business plan of foundations and strengthening and improvement. We now have a 15-year strategy, which we break in phases. So every 3 years, we'll have a kind of new phase. But hopefully we don't need a strategy refreshing for a good decade at least.
So how did you do that? Was it the same sort of 2 days, rather intense, kind of the place where it all came together, or was there something else that happened there?
No, it was a lot longer because it needed much more time. We wanted a lot more voices as well. So we split it into 3 phases. So we had our curiosity phase, which was about 3 months, 50 plus conversations with external partners, funders, individuals in the system, conversations with our staff, with trustees. And that gave a bit of a straw person that we were able to kind of challenge. So then we had 3 months of our challenge phase. And that was when everything that we either believed or said or assumed was, turned on its head, challenged, rebuilt or not. And then that kind of led us to creating the Nourishing Futures strategy. Arguably the third and final stage we'll never finish, which is the change stage. So that was then us towards the end of the kind of old business plan, thinking about what's going to have to change for us to successfully deliver this. So one of the key kind of aspects, because it's a longer term strategy, it just needs much more agility. The spreadsheet of KPIs that got us through 2022 to 2025 wasn't going to cut it quite as effectively for this longer term and more unknowable and emergent strategy. We've introduced a lot more learning and feedback loops, reflections into our practice and our ways of working and strategy review. And we're still very much, we're in second quarter of a 15-year strategy. I would definitely say it is a strategy that has started to rewire our thinking, our ways of working, to ensure that impact ultimately, if, again, going back to being an organization that wants to change the world, if you're doing anything toward that, you're going to have to change yourselves. That's our positive mantra, is that, goodness, there's a lot of change happening. Isn't that brilliant?
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So as you talked through that, it sounds like there was a fairly sophisticated strategic approach, if you don't mind my using that. Is that something you came up with on your own? Did someone in the organization kind of design it? Was it designed collaboratively? Did you use somebody externally? How'd you get to that?
It was definitely a collaborative effort. So one of the things I was really conscious of as chief exec, and given where we were, where the system was at the time, was that I wanted an external consultant to facilitate and lead that conversation. Whereas back in 2021, 22, it felt really important that I led it and I heard and got to know everybody through that strategic direction setting. What I didn't want was to limit or to unintentionally, subconsciously direct the organization based on my assumptions. So we outsourced it to a facilitator, and he took, I would say, our senior leadership team, organization, our trustees on that journey. And we formed what we called our transformation team. And that was cross-departmental group of staff who came together, and we had what we called weekly tilt the head conversations. And it was when you just kind of looked at things, with a slightly different angle to your head, and okay, this is how we've always thought about that. What's the new intel and data that's come back? And so again, that practice of challenging, reviewing, reflecting, curiosity was something that we built into the strategy development process.
A question I should have asked way at the beginning, but it's really coming up for me right now. How big's the organization in terms of people?
So we've got 102 staff at Magic Breakfast.
Okay, so you could carve out a sensible group out of that to be your transformation team that doesn't feel like the whole organization, but equally isn't some tiny little drop in the ocean either.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I think we're a very nice size, if I can describe us that way, in terms of being able to, know everybody's name in the organization, but, we're big enough that we have, the flexibility in terms of people's roles and contributions.
It does, coming back to the three things you talked about, this sort of nourished, empowered, and thriving. I can see how the nourished feels like it's broader, richer, deeper, I don't know the right word, than what you have been doing. But the other two sound like they're really big challenges. And you talked earlier about how there's so many causes and, what do we really go after? How are you thinking about the balance in that and where all that might take you?
The reason why we talk about empowered and thriving is working back from that long-term vision. So that belief that if children and young people are thriving, thanks to a great start to their school day with a breakfast, then they will have been empowered to drive what that success, what that positive impact looks like. Where we see our opportunity and our role is enabling ways for schools and for policymakers. So we've started to pilot something we're calling our breakfast ambassadors, which is pupils from a small group of our partner schools to test and understand what could we provide as a charity to students so that they become the ambassadors and the champions for their school's breakfast program and bringing that back to us. So if I go back a year, 2 years, Magic Breakfast really predominantly heard from the teachers, the school staff, and they told us, and the order forms told us, but what we're increasingly asking about and hearing from is we're asking about the whole experience, hearing directly from the students themselves. And so that mechanism, whether it's something that Magic Breakfast, I wouldn't anticipate it's something Magic Breakfast would develop or scale independently on our own. There are brilliant organizations like Be Well, for instance, with their wellbeing surveys and quantitative research, that charities like Place to Be, who again really put children, young people's well-being and social and emotional health at the heart of their provision in schools. So we're having lots of conversations with lots of different organizations and then bringing it back into our, I suppose, lens and framing of school breakfast, because we are at this pivotal moment for our mission and our cause. The government has committed to every primary age pupil having access to a free breakfast club by the end of this parliament. A really simple way that I think about it is, wouldn't it be a shame if in 5 or 10 years somebody has to set up a charity to address failing breakfast clubs in England? This is the moment. Let's do it right. It won't be without challenge and without bumps and cul-de-sacs, but let's try and get to that vision sooner rather than allowing something to evolve and emerge that then needs fundamental reform or unpicking. So we're hoping that we can provide not just the good practice, but also the inbuilt mechanisms and infrastructure that children are always informing and guiding what great looks like. And so that just is what good is, where
Yeah.
you're listening to children and young people's voices.
Yeah. Lindsey, that's actually probably a pretty good note for us to at least start wrapping things up. But before we do that, is there any misconception about child hunger or school breakfast provision that you'd like to challenge, or anything else you want to share with our listeners?
There are two key things that I think are really important to understand. One is that this food system as a whole, isn't working as it should for any of us, and that's not to do with, finances, broken food system. There are parts of the country where you can, barely find fresh fruit and vegetables. It costs twice as much, according to the Food Foundation's kind of annual report on shopping baskets, to buy a healthy, calorie, nutrient-rich shopping basket as it does to buy more affordable, cheaper alternatives. So I think we need to remember that people are doing the best they possibly can in a broken system, and parts of our country are more broken than others. It does frustrate me, to say the least, when I see or hear suggestions that it's parents or carers or community's fault, or worse still, that it's the children's fault. In a more positive and uplifting kind of framing that I would just emphasize is the incredible impact and power of something that, despite everything we've talked about for the last, 40 or so minutes, which is incredibly simple. So to provide a magic breakfast is 34 pence. And that's with all of that wraparound, the support, the advice. I think there is something to just kind of hang on to in terms of the simplicity of a good idea. Those do exist, and just hanging on to that is something I certainly find reassuring and motivating.
Oh, that's really fantastic. Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing such a really compelling and uplifting story. It's always great to hear about some things that I don't think even you would say they're working perfectly, but it sounds like they're working.
But that's it. No, and a work in progress is
Yeah.
is the other thing. But we will keep making progress, and I think that's the joy of the charity sector. Lots of people who have the energy and will continue to push. Thank you so much for having me. It's been brilliant.
Again, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.